2, The Second Age, Chapter 4, The History of Galadriel and Celeborn, and of Amroth, King of Lothlórien, Part 2. Amroth and Nimrodel. Okay, so I find that this section of the chapter kind of bounces around a bit because there are many references to notes and appendices. So I'm going to reorder it slightly so that background information is given first, and then the story of Amroth and Nimrodel comes after, and so on and so forth. This section features a lot of discussion of sylvan elves. So let's look at them a bit more closely. In case you didn't know, the English word sylvan just means anything having to do with the forest. The sylvan elves are descended from the Nandor. The Nandor, if you remember, are those Telleran elves who quit the great journey from Cuivienen when they get to the Misty Mountains. They just decide to hang out in the woods around the river Anduin. But the green elves of Osiriand, remember those guys? They are not considered sylvan elves. Sylvan elves always stayed behind in the woods east of the Misty Mountains. They're the elves originally from Mirkwood and Lothlórien. So the ones you see in the movies, these guys, and these guys, are sylvan elves. Or rather, mostly sylvan elves, but I'll get to that in a bit. But not these guys, they're Noldor and Sindar. Okie doke? So anyway, the sylvan elves, or Tawarwaith, are a small, scattered people who are pretty secretive and prefer to remain hidden and mind their own business. They seem similar to the Avari in that respect. They generally welcome the Noldor and Sindar who come east at the beginning of the Second Age. And under the leadership of these great elves, the sylvan elves become more ordered and increase in wisdom. And they don't have any native writing system, and by the time of the events of The Lord of the Rings, no one really speaks Sylvan Elvish anymore, at least not in Mirkwood or Lorien. Everyone just speaks Sindarin. I just mentioned Noldor and Sindar coming east in the Second Age. Before the building of Barad-dûr in Second Age 1000, some Sindarin elves pass over the Misty Mountains and establish realms in which they rule over Sylvan elves. Let's look at one of these realms, Mirkwood, or rather Greenwood the Great. The Sylvan elves who live here are the kin of the Lorien elves, and they migrate north under their Sindarin king Orofer, father of Thranduil, grandfather of Legolas. He's originally from Doriath, as are the other Sindar who come with him to Greenwood. He moves his people north to get away from the dwarves of Moria, and he also resents Galadriel and Celeborn's intrusions in Lorien. Don't worry, I'll get to them soon enough. And despite his people's desire not to meddle in the affairs of others, Orofer does have enough foresight to see that peace will never happen unless Sauron is defeated. So, for the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age, 3434, he leads a great army of the Sylvan Elves of Greenwood and Lorien into battle. These guys are brave, don't get me wrong, but 1, their weaponry is just not heavy-duty enough, and 2, they don't want to fall under the supreme command of Gil-galad, so they're not really good at following directions. Thus, they suffer unnecessarily heavy losses. Orofer dies in the Battle of Dagorlad. So his son Thranduil also fights in the war, but he survives, and he becomes the new king of Greenwood. So now we're in the Third Age, and after a while, the Sylvan Elves start to recover their numbers, but Thranduil knows in his heart that Sauron is not totally gone. To add to that, men are spreading throughout the land, some of them good, some of them not so good, and they're encroaching near Elven territory. And about 1,000 years into the Third Age, a shadow starts to fall on Greenwood, and from then on the forest is called Mirkwood. This shadow is Sauron as the necromancer. So Thranduil moves his people all the way to the northeast of the forest, where he builds his great underground halls, kind of like a mini version of Menegroth. Of course, it could never look as good as Menegroth, but, it's the thought that counts. Okay. So that was Mirkwood, but let's shift gears and go back to the Second Age and switch our attention to the other Sylvan realm, Lorien, or Lorinand, whatever you want to call it. So there are Sindar here who, just like in Greenwood, have come and mingled with the native Sylvan population. The Sindarin king here is called Amdir, or Malgalad. But in addition to Sindar, according to this section, many Noldor pass through Khazad-dûm after the destruction of Eregion in 1697, and they settle in and mingle as well. This is the same year that Elrond establishes Imladris, if you remember that from the last video. So this version of the events greatly differs from the other section concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, because here it says that Celeborn actually goes to Lórien and fortifies it against any further attack from Sauron, and when Sauron is routed out of Eriador, Celeborn goes to join Galadriel, who's now in Lindon for some reason. But in a separate writing, it says that after the fall of Eregion, both Galadriel and Celeborn lead a bunch of Noldor through Khazad-dûm and go to live in Lórien for a while. Well, all these different comings and goings, they can get a little complicated, and later writings don't really nail down where Galadriel and Celeborn spend the rest of the Second Age, so it can get kind of confusing. This account goes on to say that Lórien experiences many years of peace after the War of the Elves and Sauron under their king Amdir. But, just like Orofer, he too joins the War of the Last Alliance, and he dies in the Battle of Dagorlad at the conclusion of the Second Age. Thus, his son Amroth becomes king of Lórien at the start of the Third Age. Okay, so now we can place Amroth in the story. And by the way, Christopher Tolkien says if Amroth really were supposed to be Galadriel and Celeborn's son, this fact surely would have been mentioned in The Lord of the Rings, which it is not. So therefore, just kind of ignore that part of the section concerning Galadriel and Celeborn. Just pretend you never heard that. So it's at some point during the Third Age that Galadriel gets a feeling of foreboding, so she and Celeborn go to Lórien, stay there a while with Amroth, and they want to gather news regarding the rising shadow in Mirkwood. So they travel around for a bit, asking questions, trying to find things out. But don't worry, they don't do a hostile takeover of Lórien or anything like that. They eventually leave it and go to live in Rivendell. Elrond is their son-in-law by now because he married Celebrian, their daughter, in Third Age 109. Well, someone else has fallen in love, and that someone is Amroth. He falls for a sylvan elf called Nimrodel. Now, the name Amroth is actually a sylvan nickname meaning up-climber or high climber. And this is because he lives in the manner of some of the elves of Lórien. He lives up in the trees. More specifically, he lives in trees that grow on a hill called Cerin Amroth. And we see this type of tree dwelling, this platform that the elves live on, in the Fellowship of the Ring when the Fellowship first comes to Lórien. It's called Talan, the plural being Telain. The English term for this structure is flet. Now keep in mind, flet is just a word that Tolkien made up. It doesn't actually exist in the dictionary, and I just love that. Anyway, why do the elves of Lórien first build these platforms? Well, the land is pretty flat, with no good stone easily available for building, and also because the wealth of Lórien can be found in its tall, girthy trees, what better places to build refuges or lookout spots? By Third Age 1000, the land of Lórien has become a place of uneasy vigilance, what with that necromancer in Mirkwood. And Amroth's Flet is the highest point in Lórien, being originally built as a lookout post. After a while, the elves developed these structures into permanent homes, but not even everyone in Lórien lives like this. In Caras Galadhon, where Cerin Amroth is located, you'll find the highest number of actual tree dwellings. Caras Galadhon is meant to be a fortress, and not all the elves of Lórien live there. Needless to say, these tree houses are quite peculiar and unique. Now, Nimrodel loves Amroth as well, but for a long time she refuses to marry him because she regrets the coming of the Sindar and other elves from the west, because she believes they've only ever brought war and trouble with them. She prefers to live alone by a waterfall in a river that she names after herself. You might remember Legolas singing about her in The Fellowship of the Ring, and who knows, maybe it sounded something like this. Beside the falls of Nimrodel, by water clear and cool, Her voice's falling silver fell into the shining pool. Where now she wanders none can tell, in sunlight or in shade. For lost of yore was Nimrodel, and in the mountains strayed. So anyway, when the Balrog, Durin's Bane, appears in Moria in Third Age 1980, orcs start to spread outwards, and this kind of freaks her out, so she flees south in distress, and Amroth follows her. And she tells him she will only marry him if he takes her to a land of peace. So he suggests that they may as well take a ship to the Undying Lands. But they are somehow separated on their journey to the Haven, and Amroth makes it to the harbor where one last ship is about to set sail. And Nimrodel, she's nowhere to be found. Legend has it that she gets lost near the White Mountains and eventually finds a river that reminds her of her own river back in Lothlórien. She goes into a deep, long, wearisome sleep next to it and never makes it to the port. So the ship waits for many weeks until the season changes and strong winds begin to make sailing more dangerous. And one night, a violent storm rips the ship from its moorings, and when Amroth wakes up and realizes it's drifting, he jumps into the water, not wanting to leave without his fair Nimrodel, and he drowns in the waves. This is in Third Age 1981. So, at the very end of the last video, I state that it's not until Third Age 1981 that Galadriel finally returns to rule Lorien. Now you know why. Lorien is suddenly left without a leader. So Galadriel and Celeborn show up, and the people gladly welcome them, and the two of them rule that place for the rest of the Third Age. They take the titles of Lord and Lady because they prefer to be seen as guardians rather than king and queen of this easternmost outpost of the elves in Middle-earth. They are determined to keep it Sauron-free. Let's skip to the description of the elvish port where Amroth's ship is. This port is called Evelond, which means Elf Haven. It's the place from which the elves of Lorien would set sail to the Undying Lands. And according to one account, this haven is founded by Sindar escaping the sack of the havens of Beleriand after the Nirnaethar Nodiad. And they're soon joined by some adventurous sylvan elves who were never wholly free from an unquiet and a yearning for the sea. But according to a different account, a group of Doriath Sindar go south at the beginning of the Second Age, wanting to get away from the Noldor, and they found the haven at that time. You know, whether or not it's founded in the First or Third Age, it doesn't really matter because the port is abandoned in Third Age 1981 with the departure of the ship that Amroth is supposed to be on. And as you can see on the map, Evelond is very close to Dol Amroth. You may recall in The Return of the King that Legolas notices Imrahil, Prince of Dol Amroth, has some elvish blood in him. Well, how can this be? Well, when Evelond is still a working port, a small group of sylvan elves live there, kind of like a mini Grey Havens. And according to lore, the first lord of Dol Amroth, Galador, is the son of Imrazor, the Númenorian, and Mithrellas, a sylvan lady and a companion of Nimrodel. So this is why the house and kin of the lords of Dol Amroth is noble by blood as they are fair in face and mind. And don't ask me about whether or not Galador had to make a choice to remain human or elf or whatever. It doesn't explain it in this book. The Elessar. Now we move on to a totally different section that talks about the Elessar, which is a Quenya word meaning Elfstone. Christopher Tolkien indicates that this passage was probably written around the same time as the section concerning Galadriel and Celeborn. Legend has it that back in Gondolin there is a great jewel smith called Enerthil, the greatest smith since Feanor. He loves all things green and that grow, especially when the sunlight shines through the leaves of trees. So he carves a marvelous green stone that captures the light of the sun. And they say that anyone who looks at it or holds it can see things healed or feel healed from hurts themselves. Well, Nerthil gives this stone to Idril, who brings it away with her after the sack of Gondolin, and before she finally leaves Middle-earth, she gives it to her son, Eärendil, whom she instructs to use it to heal people. And when he begins his great sea voyages, he wears it upon his breast in memory of his mother. But we know that he leaves Middle-earth forever, so where does it go from there? Well, some say that Gandalf brings it with him out of the West when he and all the other wizards are sent to Middle-earth. And during one of his many conversations with Galadriel, she mentions how she misses the Undying Lands and how trees and grass there stay green forever, unlike in Middle-earth where death is inevitable. And when she suggests that maybe the Valar don't care about Middle-earth or its people anymore, Gandalf says, no, they still care, and he gives her the Elfstone, saying that she can use it to make her land the most beautiful in Middle-earth. But he tells her that she has to give it to someone else when she gets tired of Middle-earth and plans to leave forever. And that someone is Aragorn, of course. We see her give it to him in the Fellowship of the Ring. But there is a different version of the origin of the Elessar, and it goes like this. So we're in the Second Age, and it's before Sauron has even come to Eregion. Galadriel goes to Eregion and says to Celebrimbor that she's sorry to see things die in Middle-earth. But she also states that she's still not ready to leave, because she's still proud and feels that she shouldn't have to ask the Valar for pardon, because there's nothing to ask pardon for. She's done nothing wrong. And besides, she's mightier here than she would be back in Aman. And she tells him she wants her land to have trees and grass that never die. And Celebrimbor's like, yeah, well, you'd need the Elessar for that, but it's gone, and so is the guy who made it. And Galadriel's like, so Middle-earth is doomed to perish? And Celebrimbor replies, I think that's its fate. But, nevertheless, you know I love you, even though you chose Celeborn, so I'll do anything in my power to make you a little less sad. Wow, well, this is an interesting little turn of events, isn't it? Celebrimbor loves Galadriel, huh? In this story, he doesn't reveal that he is originally from Gondolin, and that he and Nerthil were actually friends. And since they were friends, he probably saw Nerthil making the Elfstone, right? So anyway, he sets to work on his own version of it, and its green color comes out more subtle and clearer than the original, although its light has less power. Why? Because the sun was still young back in the First Age, but now it's been slightly dimmed due to all of Morgoth's evil remnants of shadow lingering in the world. Oh well, the Elessar that Celebrimbor makes is still really cool. And he set it within a great brooch of silver in the likeness of an eagle rising upon outspread wings. So Galadriel uses it to beautify her realm, but once she acquires the Ring of Power Nenya, she figures she doesn't need the Elfstone anymore, so she gives it to her daughter Celebrian, who gives it to Arwen, and then it eventually winds up with Aragorn. Now, I would be remiss if I failed to discuss the last bit of information in this chapter regarding the port of Lond Daer and the surrounding lands. The port used to be called Vignalonde, but it's eventually renamed Lond Daer, or Great Haven. We saw in the last video that during the War of the Elves and Sauron, part of the Númenórean armada arrives at the mouth of the Gwathlo. Gwathlo means Grey Flood, and it separates the land of Minhiriath and Enedwaith. Minhiriath means between the rivers, because it's located between the Baranduin and the Gwathlo. Enedwaith means middle folk. Now, these lands are wide and flat, and where the river Glanduin, meaning border river, meets the river Mithaethel, meaning Horwell, in other words, Grey Spring, the water becomes sluggish and spreads out into a vast fenland, or marshland, where many swans live. And indeed, this area is called Nin in Elf, Waterlands of the Swans. And when the Númenóreans first start to explore Middle-earth in the early Second Age, these two lands are mostly covered in continuous forest. The original name that the Númenóreans give the Gwathlo is Gwathir, meaning River of Shadow, because the trees tower over it on either side, so the water looks really dark and shadowy. They only name it Gwathlo once they reach the fens further up the river. And we know that during Aldarion's time, he's always on the lookout for timber, and he absolutely loves these great woods and all their potential. This is why he chooses to build the port here, as a place to collect timber and build ships. The forest-dwelling men here are numerous but scattered, and they are in awe of the Numenoreans, and they don't become hostile until the Numenoreans start cutting down trees on a large scale. So these guys attack them whenever they can, so the Numenoreans treat them like enemies and don't bother to replant or maintain the land. I guess they do clear-cutting out of spite or something. So the people in Minhiriath flee to Erin Vorn, and those in Enedwaith flee to the foothills of the Misty Mountains. This place will eventually be called Dunland. So the Numenoreans devastate the land, because they not only use the wood to build ships, but they bring a bunch of it back to Numenor to build other things there too. So of course, when Sauron shows up to make war on the elves, the displaced peoples give their allegiance to him in hopes of taking revenge on the Numenoreans. He uses them as spies and guides for his raiders. But we know from the last video that he doesn't have enough forces to focus on attacking the Numenorean settlements. He just sets fires to some of the forests and their wood stores. So by the time of the Third Age, most of these plains are grasslands, and only part of Minhiriath and southeast Enedwaith still have woods. That's how much the Numenoreans changed the landscape. The river Glanduin means border river because, at first, it marked the southern border of Eregion. Then later on, along with the Gwathlo, it forms the southern boundary of the kingdom of Arnor. Enedwaith is called Middlefolk because the people who live there aren't really under the control of either Arnor or Gondor, and they're not of Numenorean origin. Nevertheless, the great north-south road that connects the two kingdoms cuts straight through this area. So both kingdoms build a great bridge at Tharbad and maintain the long causeways that carry the road over the fens. And they drain much of these marshlands. They also make a river port, big enough to take sea-going ships, and they even keep a garrison of soldiers, engineers, and mariners there. But after the early 1600s of the Third Age, the place is abandoned to decay. And long before the events of The Lord of the Rings, it's already reverted back to wild marshlands. So it's actually quite difficult for Boromir to travel from Gondor to Rivendell when he comes this way to attend the Council of Elrond. That journey itself is quite remarkable, so it just shows how hardy he was.